Welcome to Libraries Today. This program is intended to recognize and highlight the unexpected ways local libraries serve their communities today. I'm your host, Stan Howe. In this episode, we will feature the history of libraries in West Virginia and discuss how we got to where we are today. Libraries in the state have come a long way since the West Virginia Library Commission was founded by the state legislature back in 1929. At the time, there were just 26 libraries in the state, and only 14 of those were publicly funded. These libraries were generally located in the state's largest cities and towns, like Huntington, Charleston, Parkersburg, Wheeling, and Clarksburg. Most counties didn't have a public library at all. Slowly but surely, things began to change. Over the next 40 years, publicly funded libraries started popping up all across the state, in towns like Bridgeport, Oak Hill, and Lewisburg. But West Virginia libraries hit their biggest growth spurt in the 1970s, when the Library Commission and the state legislature began a concentrated effort to provide more library services to residents. 46 libraries were established in the 70s, and by 1979, every county in the state had a public library. Today, West Virginia residents have 172 public libraries to visit and enjoy. Although the Cabell County Public Library and the Parkersburg Wood County Public Library both reside in new, modern buildings today, originally they were housed in what was then state-of-the-art buildings funded by the Carnegie Foundation over a century ago. Both of these magnificent structures are still standing, and on today's show, we'll pay them both a visit. Earlier, I had a chance to visit with Library Director Judy Rule and local historian James Casto, and I learned quite a bit about the history of the Cabell County Public Library. We're here now in the Cabell County Library, and with me is Library Director Judy Rule and local author and historian James Casto. Guys, thanks for being with us today. We want to talk about that magnificent facility across the street, which is the old Cabell County Library, opened, I believe, in 1904, a Carnegie Foundation library. Mr. Casto, tell me a little bit about that library building.
Well, the roots of the library stretch back to the late 1890s, when a group of public-spirited citizens decided that a growing town needed a library. The local ministerial association got behind the effort. That gave it a big boost. People began donating books, and they rented one room on 4th Avenue and opened a library in 1902. That same year, Andrew Carnegie, the steelman philanthropist, offered the city $25,000 to build a new building. Carnegie routinely set two conditions for communities to accept his grants. The city had to provide the site, and they had to guarantee operating funds. The city of Huntington donated a corner site at 5th Avenue and 9th Street, and the local school board said they would provide the operating cash. So the library opened in 1905. Before that happened, however, though, they changed the plans on the building, and they decided to include a small auditorium. And they asked Carnegie for another $10,000.
Did he give him the money?
He did, somewhat to everyone's surprise and relief. That building, a classic Beaux Arts design, would serve the city for 75 years. In the 1940s, the scope of the library changed, and what had been the Huntington Public Library became the Cabell County Library. And in 1980, the library moved across the street from its original location to a new modern building.
And Judy, you were on hand for that. You had worked in the old library, what, 17 years?
Yes, I was there 17 years. I was hired straight out of library school in 1967, and that was the year that the local law was passed by the legislature that created the Cabell County Library in its current physical form. It mandated funding from the County Commission and Board of Education's excess levy. But we moved then. I worked there for 17 years. I started as an adult services coordinator and then became assistant director. And I was in charge of getting everything moved to this building.
And that was a huge undertaking to move. I know it's just across the street.
Absolutely.
But a huge undertaking.
We were closed for 2 weeks. And on the Saturday, the middle Saturday of those 2 weeks, we had over 600 volunteers who showed up to help move the books. And we moved all the books from that library to this library. And generally speaking, they found the proper shelf to be on. I won't guarantee that the books were in order on the shelf, but they were moved from that building to this building, and they found that we had them all color-coded, and the shelves on this floor are red, as you can see, the end panels, and on the first floor they're green. So the books were color-coded, the labels on them over there, and they were matched to a specific shelf in this building. The air conditioning went off in this building, and the elevator went out in this building. It was so they slid the books up we had them in boxes, and they slid the boxes up the stairwell to get to the proper, when the books came to this floor.
It's an amazing story, actually. You know, the thing that strikes me is we look at these two libraries and we look at the old library. It's magnificent architecture, and I think it's great that it's still here. Over the years, so it's been nearly 40 years now since it hasn't been operated as a library. So, Mr. Castro, what's it been used like over the years?
Well, briefly, when the library moved to this building, a restaurant was opened in the Carnegie building. It was called the Old Library Restaurant. It ultimately, though, did not prove successful, and the Huntington Junior College then moved in, and they have made splendid use and have taken extraordinarily good care of the building.
The junior college, and we serve as their library, and we have a contract with them, and so they allow our full-time staff to take classes for free at the junior college, and that's one of the benefits we offer our employees. And several have taken advantage of that, but they needed to have a professional librarian on staff
To be accredited.
To be accredited. So we serve as their professional librarian on staff, and they pay us a stipend each year, and we have a good relationship.
You know, it's a great facility, but it's not the only Carnegie Library that was built in the state. Can you give us a little bit of background about the others?
Carnegie offered 8 grants to communities in the state. For various reasons, only 4 of those communities were able to accept and use the grant. Huntington was the first Carnegie Library that was built. Also, one was built in Parkersburg and one in Hinton, and an academic library on the campus at Bethany College up in the northern Panhandle.
And I believe we talked before we went on camera that all 4 are still standing.
To the best of my knowledge, all 4 are still in use, although none are libraries anymore.
What are they? Do you happen to know offhand?
Well, I've lost track of the building in Parkersburg. I really don't know what it is, but when they built a new library at Bethany, they turned the old library into an administration building, and in Hinton, the original Carnegie Library is now a museum.
That's very interesting. James, Judy, I appreciate you both being with us today. It's a fascinating story, and it's a fascinating building. I'm glad it's still part of the city of Huntington.
We are too. We are too.
Earlier, I had a chance to visit one of the other old Carnegie libraries, the one in Parkersburg. We'll take a look at it when we come back.
Welcome to Understood.org, a free online resource for parents of kids with learning and attention issues, with personalized recommendations, tools, and daily access to experts to help your child thrive. Understood.org, because understanding is everything.
Welcome back to Libraries Today, where we're focusing on the development and history of public libraries in West Virginia. I'm standing here in front of one of the true landmark structures in the state, Parkersburg's old Carnegie Library, built back in 1905. In 1943, lightning struck the very top of this building and caused extensive structural damage. At the time, it was described as a disastrous fire, but not one book was damaged by fire or water, and the library survived. Parkersburg replaced this grand old building with a new library in 1976, and the county has added 3 branch libraries in the years since then. Let's head over to the current Parkersburg Wood County Public Library and learn more. We're back in the Parkersburg Wood County Library, where we're going to talk a little bit about what the old Carnegie Library was like. And with me now is the head of technical services for the library, Hazel Stewart. And Hazel, you were actually in the old library and worked there.
I was actually head of technical services there.
Wow.
I was hired in late '67 when they were reorganizing the library board, and started in '68 with just me and Dorothy Muse, who was the first library director under the reorganization.
Wow. You know, the thing that struck me looking at the old library is the architecture. It's a beautiful building.
Yes, yes. On the inside, it's sort of, it has glass floors. It has a winding staircase to go up to the other levels. And remember, this was back in the days when women wore skirts to work, and we often were a little embarrassed to walk up the stairs with a load of books and through the glass ceiling.
Did it have elevators at that point?
We had a dummy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we walked up and down the winding staircase many, many times shelving books.
Wow. You know, although it's beautiful, a terrific looking building, it really wasn't made for modern library services, was
No, all those old Carnegie buildings look pretty much like that one. I believe was constructed in 1905.
it? Right.
So
As head of technical services, and as libraries were changing even then, they've changed, of course, a lot more since then. What kind of problems did you run into trying to keep the library modernized?
well, we were just using typewriters, and we typed on cards similar to this. And I had one helper. She was a co-op student from the high school, and she worked 44 years from that building to this building, and she just retired a couple years ago. So that's what we had. We just had me and Louise, and we just had our typewriters right there. They were electronic, at least, and that's how we did it.
Technical services libraries have certainly come a long way.
Yes.
What are the biggest changes you've seen in all those years?
Well, we had to just do it all on our own, no mechanical. Now we just use a scanner, has an ISBN on the bottom of the book, and the record pops up. We correct it, put a label on it, and send it upstairs.
Well, Hazel, thanks for spending a little time with us. We appreciate it. Let's go find Library Director Brian Rates and take a look at what the library is like today. With me now is the director of the Parkersburg Wood County Library, Brian Rates. Brian, so we've been talking about the old Carnegie Library. Things have come a long way since then.
Yes.
Tell me about this facility.
This facility was built 40 years ago, and I take pride in that the former director, the two directors before me, they did a good job of keeping it up. It looks fairly new. It doesn't look 40 years, but it was a big improvement from the old Carnegie Library. It was a bigger size library. They could do a lot more services. They had meeting rooms. They had a bigger collection. But they had to grow into it when they first built it in '76. They didn't have the funding at that time to use it and at its ability. It took them about 11 years till they got better funding. And since then, we've grown and we're getting ready to redo this building again, probably in the next couple of years.
Well, this building had to adapt.
Yes.
40 years, and libraries, even the last 40 years, are very different than what they were then.
Yeah. So our next big doing is we'll be moving the entrance from over here to the side of the building. Will be more accessible for the public, and probably trying to make more public space. Because as you'll eventually get to see the old Carnegie Library, you'll see the old South Library, which was one of the first Insta libraries, and you'll also get to see the brand new library on South Side that replaced it, that we opened up in January, and it's more about people space.
You've been here 16 years.
Yes.
What's the biggest change in libraries that you've seen?
It's become more of a people space, especially. Programming has really exploded over the last 5 to 6 years, I think, in libraries overall. Libraries are becoming more of a community center for not just reading materials and research, but research is probably the biggest area that's changed. It's adapted to the new technologies out there, but libraries are one of the few places in the community where people can go to be around other people but still be by themselves. And it's an interesting location to go to. Plus, you still have all the reading interest there, but now we're breaking out into the virtual world with electronic books and audio books that are downloadable. And so some people that use the library don't even come into the library. But then there are quite a few people that come into the library that never check out materials. They use it for other purposes. So it serves all kinds of areas of the community.
You mentioned the Parkersburg South Library. What's interesting about that, it's the new library opened in January, but it was one of the original Insta libraries in the state. One of the West Virginia went through a big library building expansion in the 70s. It was one of those libraries. Now you have a brand new facility.
Yeah, it was our first branch too, for Wood County, and Wood County is one of the largest counties. And at that time, it was one of the largest counties in the state. And we only had the Carnegie Library downtown, and that was the first branch. They did have a small library up in Vienna, which is a separate municipal library, but yeah, that was the first branch. They did have a bookmobile at that time, but to really branch out and go out to the community and serve the different areas. And that was the main reason why we expanded the library on South Side, is because it was all about access, is that you had a library, that little Kanawha River separated the community, and there was a huge portion of the community that just wasn't using this library as well as it could have, because it wasn't as accessible to them. And opening that branch has just exploded the usage.
Thanks, Brian.
All right.
When we come back, we'll talk more about the history of West Virginia Public Libraries with Library Commissioner Dr. Charles Julian. We'll be right back after this message.
Every child is curious.
George, look what I found.
Turn their curiosity into a lifelong love of learning. Create a curious reader.
This is super bedtime reading.
Share a book together today. Visit read.gov.
Welcome back. We have a special guest in our studio today, State Library Commissioner Charles Julian. Dr. Julian, thanks for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Stan, and always to talk about our state's public libraries.
Well, first, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm a native West Virginian, grew up in Wheeling in Hyatt County, and I went to school there, and most of my family is still there. I can remember as a child walking to the public library and being shown briskly up to the young adults, the children's section, not to mix with the adults in that library. I subsequently went on and got a degree at Glenville State College, then had an opportunity to go abroad as a Rotary Ambassadorial Fellow at the University of Sheffield in England. Then did a little bit of work in school libraries and some other libraries. Then I went to Vanderbilt University to library school for my first American master's degree, and then ultimately to Florida State University, where I ended up doing a PhD in library science. So I've had a lot of library education. I also worked in a number of different library jobs, mostly in academia, from media librarian, cataloger to director of multi-campus libraries. So it's been an interesting career.
Well, tell us, what were libraries like in the early 20th century?
In the early 20th century, as you noted before, there were not tons of libraries in the state. There were just in the big municipalities, libraries that were connected to communities, often where population centers were, or areas of higher education or classical organizations, literary societies. And the big boom came in around the 1950s, the mid-1950s, when the Library Services Act was enacted by Congress. That act specifically focused on rural libraries. So for this state, it was a great opportunity for us to build libraries and to have some funding from the federal government. Prior to that time, we did not have a library commission that had a budget and money to be able to contribute. So the two merged together very well, that we had a brand new library commission that had a mission and had been in existence for a while without any funding, and then the merging of federal dollars. So we saw some collections develop. We saw some what were called demonstration projects, some infrastructure to start building these libraries.
But early on in the 20th century, the Carnegie Foundation poured millions of dollars across the country into libraries. How did that affect West Virginia?
West Virginia had an opportunity to build multiple Carnegie libraries. Usually the way the system worked is that the Carnegie Corporation insisted on a local maintenance of effort, and that was based on a formula on your population. And so it was usually about 10%. And then they would offer a grant based on what they felt your population should be able to support, and then that you had to match with the local maintenance of effort money. Only 4 libraries ultimately accepted the money and built libraries, and they were in, as we saw already, in Parkersburg and Huntington, also at Bethany College and in Hinton. Wheeling
said no.
Pardon me?
Wheeling said no to
Yes, Wheeling said no. Wheeling said no for a very acrid reason, and that was the labor unions in the area. The trade assembly people said, we don't want to build a monument to Andrew Carnegie with his blood money. And they were referring to the strike at Homestead, Pennsylvania, where Pinkerton guards came in at Carnegie's insistence, or at least Frick's insistence, who was working with Carnegie in the steel company at that time. And people were killed, lives were lost. And so when the election was held to decide whether to accept the money from the Carnegie Corporation, it was defeated. It was defeated soundly, partially because the labor unions rose up against it, and also there was a flood at the time, and there was all kinds of physical problems going on in the community, so there wasn't a huge turnout for the election.
So we had slow growth throughout most of the 20th century, but things really took off in the 1970s. What happened?
Well, we had some more federal money come about. That old Library Services Act all of a sudden became the Library Services and Construction Act. And so there wasn't so much a focus on rural, but there was a focus on construction. And we had some very savvy congressional representatives, including Arch Moore, who looked at those dollars and looked at how we might use those dollars to begin to build libraries. And so that's when you see a big influx of libraries being built, not only in West Virginia, but all around the country.
Over 170 libraries in West Virginia today.
Yes.
Have we reached a saturation point?
I don't know that we've reached a saturation point. We certainly have access throughout all of the counties, which is good. And that didn't happen until 1979, when Gilmer County became the last county to have a library placed there. Now, in that instance, it's an interesting occurrence that happened there, because the community wasn't really sure they wanted a library in that county, because they had Glenville State College, and Glenville State College was acting as a community library. But ultimately, the commission and some other folks in the community convinced people that a county library sitting by itself would be a good thing. So in this state, often libraries are not just repositories for books, but they are meeting places. They are places where the community comes together. They are places that really provide the heart of the community. And I think that there will be more instances where some of that occurs, and we'll see a few more libraries springing up throughout the state.
You know, throughout this show, we've talked about where libraries have been and what we have done over the past 100 years or so. Getting out your crystal ball, and where do you see libraries going in the future?
I think libraries are already beginning to branch out into areas that don't rely so much on a physical location of materials. People are getting on the internet and finding audiobooks and electronic books and resources. So we're serving people who don't necessarily come into the community. That being said, I think we're seeing some libraries like Ohio County and other libraries throughout the state providing real services in taking the history and heritage of communities and developing programming around it, building special areas for genealogy. And in Ohio County, whenever they do these programs with Lunch with Books that are historic based, they fill the room. You have hundreds of people come and not only want to hear about their history, but talk about how they participated in that history, how it affected their lives. What was it like to grow up in South Wheeling and Fulton and all these areas of the city? And as they do that, the library is capturing these narratives and building them into the other pieces of the fabric of the historical studies.
You know, I think Andrew Carnegie would be really surprised about where libraries are today from his day funding all those libraries across the country. Dr. Julian, appreciate your time, and thanks so much for dropping by.
Always a pleasure, Stan.
The West Virginia Library Commission encourages lifelong learning, individual empowerment, civic engagement, and an enriched quality of life by enhancing library and information services for all West Virginians. For questions or comments regarding topics on this show, please do not hesitate to call us at 1-800-642-9021 or visit us online at www.librarycommission.wv.gov. To keep you updated on library happenings in the state and beyond, the West Virginia Library Commission uses the WVLC website, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube channel, and the Library Lookout newsletter. If you haven't liked us or followed us on social media yet, please do.
Packers, Vikings,
Red State, Blue State.
We come from different places.
Uptown.
But when we live united, we create real lasting change in the education, income, and health of our country. United. Real change won't happen without you. So give, advocate, volunteer, live united. Sign up at liveunited.org.
I'd like to thank Judy Rule and James Casto for talking with us today about the history of the Cabell County Public Library. I'd also like to say thank you to Brian Rates, the director of the Parkersburg Wood County Public Library, and the library's head of technical services, Hazel Stewart. We've learned quite a bit about both of these libraries, their history, and how they've developed into great community centers. And last but not least, thank you to State Library Commissioner Dr. Charles Julian for stopping by to share his knowledge and expertise on the history of West Virginia's public libraries. Libraries in the state have come a long way since the early 1900s, and today they provide a wide range of resources and activities. To find out more about the resources available to you, contact your local library. I'm your host, Stan Howe. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Libraries Today.